Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson unveiled his 2026 budget plan today. Now, the gap in that budget is bigger than first thought. It is more than $1 billion. Now, the mayor promises no property tax hike and no grocery tax. So where is he going to find the money to plug that hole?
It's a key part of the mayor's budget proposal is a corporate head tax. That is a tax on the biggest companies in the city based on how many employees they have. It's something the city got rid of more than a decade ago. But now the mayor wants to bring it back, and already it's proving to be a tough sell.
The city of Chicago is in big trouble, and we've already talked in the past about their projected 2026 budget deficit, which, according to our last video and the projections that we saw back then, was going to be just short of $1 billion. However, Brandon Johnson has recently dropped the 2026 proposal, and guess what? They are now running up against a budget deficit of well over $1 billion, and this is coming from a guy who talked about how the city of Chicago could totally take care of all the illegal migrants, they could 100% pay off the teachers union, and of course, they could do all these different various social programs without raising property taxes, or at least that's how Brandon Johnson used to talk, because he campaigned on not raising property taxes. But when the budget deficit seemed disastrous a couple of years ago, he actually attempted this. He was rejected by his city council, and it looks like his new tax proposal, which includes a tax on employment, and if you start taxing people for hiring people, presumably they would hire people less, is also likely to be dead on arrival, because even though Chicago is a very strong Democratic city, it seems like the aldermen are jumping ship from the ever more unpopular Brandon Johnson. However, he's trying to power forward with all these different various new taxes, and guess what? The local ABC affiliate, during the course of an interview, caught him in a major lie on what these taxes were actually supposed to fund. So this is what we're going to talk about today. Brandon Johnson's "I'm going to only tax the ultra rich" absolute nonsense, and of course the real things that he's trying to fund with these tax and spend programs, and why Chicago won't actually get out of their deficit if they go down this path. But before we get into that, I want to thank everybody for closing my deficit over at actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Mayor Brandon Johnson's 2026 budget proposal would not only revive but steeply increase the tax on big companies. He's pitching it as a way to fund community safety.
And so we are asking big tech to chip in. We are asking corporate landlords and yacht owners to chip in, but we are also asking the larger corporations to step up in this moment.
So as you just heard right there, Brandon Johnson is trying to sell this tax plan the way that progressives always try to sell their tax plan, which is, oh, the big companies, the ultra rich, you got to chip in. You got to contribute more to the system. You need more skin in the game. When in reality, if you were to actually unmask Brandon Johnson right here in this moment, he'd sound a lot more like this.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay?
But look, we actually have to ask the question to ourselves, why is a corporate head tax so stupid in terms of policy? And the reason for that is quite simple. It's elementary even. If you start taxing employers that employ over 100 people, $21 per person per month, which doesn't sound like it's all that much, that is going to create additional costs. And by the way, this is actually significantly higher than the tax as it previously existed before it was repealed under Rahm Emanuel's administration. And that is going to create a disincentive into hiring people. I mean, again, imagine you employ 103 people. Do you think to yourself, wait a minute, I could save $21 per employee per month if I just get it down to 99 people? Obviously, you're going to go in that direction. And by the way, we see with a lot of government programs where regulations end up kicking in at 50 employees or 100 employees, that there's a curious number of companies that are just below that threshold. Again, there's a reason why this tax was removed from the city of Chicago, because what you're doing is actually taxing jobs. And guess what? If you end up with more layoffs, then you're going to get less money via the income tax, which is going to cut off any gains that you're actually going to get with this corporate head tax. And by the way, we don't have to look to Chicago of the past to understand this concept. Seattle actually put this tax into place, and when they realized that the business community was not going to respond to it well, a month later, they actually actually repealed it, because again, this is just not a good idea in terms of trying to keep jobs in play, to tax employment, to charge people for hiring people.
The tax would apply to companies with at least 100 employees, about 3% of corporations in Chicago. They would have to pay $21 per employee each month. It's drawing criticism from business leaders and aldermen concerned about jobs.
In 2018 in Seattle, they passed this a similar type thing, and it was repealed less than a month later because of similar concerns.
Now, if you listen to the aldermen that support Brandon Johnson, you can hear the line that they're going with, which is Trump bad, Orange Man bad. We have to do this because of the evil Orange Man. Again, another clip from Anna Kasparian. It comes right into play right here.
However, Johnson's supporters put the blame on the Trump administration.
When we think about the upward push with the tax cuts that have been made on some of the wealthiest of Chicagoans, I do believe that it brings some level of equality.
Trump simply hearing Trump over and over again.
But in reality, the reason why Chicago is in this dispute with the Trump administration is because Chicago refuses to turn over criminal migrants to ICE agents. So ICE ends up responding by conducting raids in the city of Chicago. Then Chicago allows protesters to target ICE and attack facilities. And again, this is all a disaster that, of course, starts at the origin point of Brandon Johnson. But in addition to that, they're also proposing like an excise tax similar to how they have on alcohol or tobacco against social media companies. Now, of course, Brandon Johnson is getting ripped to shreds on social media, on platforms like YouTube, on platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and X. So this is obviously targeting his political opponents. But his explanation of how this is going to be implemented is just stupid.
Another big priority in the budget, a new tax on large-scale social media companies like X, YouTube, and Meta, which owns Facebook. Johnson calling it a first in the nation, but critics expect legal challenges.
And just like we tax other addictive vices that are bad for our health, like nicotine and tobacco, it is far past time we treat social media companies the same way.
Now, look, I know some people are going to say, yeah, Brandon Johnson's saying social media bad, it's addictive, and all those no-no words that have become all too popular on the internet.com, ironically on social media apps. But in reality, the way that you're going to implement this tax does not seem feasible. It seems ridiculous. It seems like it's a joke. And as they said right there in that report, guess what? This is probably going to be subject to legal challenges. So in order to get this revenue, which will ultimately end up being paid by the users, Brandon Johnson is going to end up in a court battle on whether or not the tax that he's trying to implement actually makes any sense at all whatsoever. But again, this is the desperation of Brandon Johnson. This is what he's trying to do. And in reality, he's trying to sell this based on lies because his previous lies aren't actually working out in order to push this. So if you guys will remember, Brandon Johnson talked about how we needed to save black children and save black teachers, and you're an evil white racist if you didn't endorse his previous property tax increase or his previous high interest loan in order to pay off the teachers union. But now he's trying to shift with the times and say that this is actually about public safety, even though again, the only group that appears to be supporting him in these new taxes is of course the teachers union, Chicago Public Schools.
Not everyone is against the budget plan. A former teacher and CTU organizer, Mayor Johnson, wants to give $500 million in TIF surplus funds to Chicago Public Schools. In a statement, the Chicago Teachers Union says, today, Mayor Brandon Johnson delivered the most transformative budget to come out of City Hall in generations. He is protecting our city from Trump's cuts and proposing a budget that fights for working people instead of against them.
Again, organizations that Brandon Johnson is a direct profiteer from, they're the only ones that are backing this particular proposal.
We believe this is a reasonable approach to generate revenue, to challenge our larger corporations to put more skin in the game, to ensure that we continue to make sure that our communities are driving violence down.
The business community blasted the plan along with other corporate taxes.
Did you convene a meeting with labor to discuss savings and efficiency and burden sharing on their part?
Well, we did. Well, first of all, let me just say, the vast majority of our corporate fund is geared towards community safety. and public safety as a whole.
Now, you know a Democrat is in trouble when they can't even rely upon the media in order to propagandize for them on their behalf. So Brandon Johnson, even though he granted this sit-down interview to the local ABC affiliate, is getting absolutely chewed out by this guy. First and foremost, he says, wait a minute, did you actually talk to labor, you know, the public sector labor unions that are extracting so much money from your budget, about where they can cut back, about where they can reduce, about them putting some skin into the game? And Brandon Johnson, obviously looking very distraught, is like, oh yeah, we had these conversations with everyone and they seem to be on board with the plan, even though there's shared sacrifice. But again, I just showed you that Chicago Public Schools is totally on board with this, being the only agency that is on board with this. But again, you gotta wait to see when Brandon Johnson tries to sell this as an issue of public safety, as an issue of policing, because all of the previously working left-wing tactics that he used to get him elected have fallen by the wayside. People aren't into the defund the police nonsense anymore. So Brandon Johnson is going to try to pretend to be on board with public safety when in reality, his plan is not about that.
So what we're talking about is we either challenge our larger corporations to put a little bit more skin in the game, or we cut 1,500 officers from our budget.
So right there, Brandon Johnson is making the case that if you don't get on board with these particular taxes, he is going to cut 1,500 officers. 1,500 officers are going to be removed from the budget because in reality, they just can't afford to actually field police officers. And this is the way that the left has been dealing with the backlash to the defund the police movement, which is essentially try to raise exorbitant taxes and say that if you're not in favor of those crazy tax increases, that somehow that means they have no choice but to cut police officers, which will make the city more dangerous. Brandon Johnson is essentially trying to take the black community hostage, use them as a prop, and use that as a way to propagandize against people. But in reality, what we're going to find out through the course of this conversation is that the program that Brandon Johnson is trying to save has nothing to do with public safety, and again, has no relation to the police department.
The mayor's office clarifying that the corporate taxes prevent the need for any layoffs or a property tax hike at a time when Johnson says Trump's tax cuts are hurting working people.
We're talking about an additional $1,200 per year on average that working people will assume because of Donald Trump's cuts to the ultra rich.
Again, people, how dumb does Brandon Johnson actually think you are? So according to Brandon Johnson, the reason they need to bring back the head tax, the reason they need to go after all these different various companies, come up with this tax on social media that treats it like tobacco or alcohol, is because President Trump in his big beautiful bill, the one big beautiful bill, actually passed a tax cut that actually helped corporations, that helped the ultra rich, the left's new favorite phrase, because a bunch of left-wingers are actually among the wealthiest in the entire country. And because of that, somehow by the transitive property, that means that you, the regular ordinary Chicagoan, are going to have to pay more taxes. Again, this is just not true. There was a tax cut across the board. If you paid more in taxes, meaning you made more money, then you got more in terms of the dollar amount back in your pocket. But that in no way, shape, or form means that somehow middle-class taxes in Chicago were automatically raised. In fact, since the big beautiful bill actually increases the SALT deduction, what that actually does is allow people to deduct more of their taxes against their federal taxes, which should actually ease the burden on Chicagoans who might want to move for a lower tax state or no tax state in comparison to what they're paying in Chicago. So what Brandon Johnson's saying here is complete nonsense. But again, the left-wing strategy is just run against Trump. Orange man bad, Trump bad. Let's play the clip again.
Trump simply hearing Trump over and over again.
And hope that you guys don't notice what they're actually saying is that they want your money.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay?
Again, we got an Ana Kasparian clip for absolutely everything. But again, we're going to get into the local news media actually doing a fantastic job pressing the issue with Brandon Johnson, and he is going to be absolutely stunned when that happens.
What happens if these big companies have people work remotely or give them part-time work and cut down their numbers?
Well, look, I can't live in hypothetical. What I can say is that we're talking about a community safety fund that will strictly go to ensuring that the mental health and well-being of our police officers is secure.
So he gets asked a very specific logistical question. What if they start cutting employees in order to get under this threshold and you don't get the revenue that you actually want? And Brandon Johnson responds by saying, oh, this is about community safety and making sure our police officers have this, that, and the other. But in reality, the local news guy is not having it. So get a load of this follow-up question that, again, Brandon Johnson was not ready for.
I can't live in hypothetical. What I can say is that we're talking about a community safety fund that will strictly go to ensuring that the mental health and well-being of our police officers is secure.
Well, the majority of that is going for the summer youth jobs, half of it.
Hiring people is a part of our safety plan. In fact, this is why this budget is so critical, right? Because this budget protects us from Trump's cuts.
You know, people say journalism is dead, but there is real journalism, and a lot of times it's coming from your local media outlets, and we got to give credit to this guy where credit is due, because Brandon Johnson thinks that he's going to get through life just saying it. Tax the rich, white people are racist, Trump bad, and then, of course, I'm going to protect police officers. This guy says, no, your budget, what you're trying to raise these taxes for and allocate that money for, is a youth jobs program. So you're essentially taxing the productive sector of the economy, the most productive companies that hire the most people. You might cost jobs that produce tax revenue there just so you can pay off this youth program, which again is a payoff to your constituency. And you're trying to say that if we don't do this, we have to fire 1,500 officers. That doesn't make any sense. Again, half the revenue that you're saying that you're going to get is to go to this program that has nothing to do with policing. And Brandon Johnson has to say, oh, wait, what is my talking point? Is it Trump bad? Or is it community safety? Hiring young black youths and paying them to do basically nonsense jobs is actually, in reality, I don't know if you guys know that, about public safety, because if you don't hire them, how can you expect them to not go out and commit shootings and murders? I mean, come on, guys. This is basic logic. This is total sanity right here. We're going to tax productive employment and social media companies in order to do unproductive employment for a core constituency. Also, we're going to back in some money to Chicago Public Schools because that's what Brandon Johnson is really all about.
This is what this is about.
Every politician is always looking ahead to the next election. This could be seen as giving the business community reason to rally around a challenger. Did you just hand potential challengers a gift with these taxes on businesses?
Here's what we've given. Here's what we've handed. We've handed the people of Chicago an opportunity to lead the charge.
Did you hand them an opportunity to elect someone else in 2027?
So, look, I don't think about my reelection.
So again, this local news reporter calling Brandon Johnson out to his face, talking about how he thinks that this is going to impact his election prospects, and Brandon Johnson's pretending like he's not a politician anymore. He's this holier-than-thou figure that doesn't care about reelection, when in reality, he absolutely 100% does. Again, think about what he's doing on a fundamental level. What are Brandon Johnson's two key constituencies? Obviously, black voters. Again, shockingly, because this doesn't happen across the country, the hardest hit by crime black neighborhoods voted for Brandon Johnson. And this is in part due to the fact that he ran an entirely racialized campaign. But the big money that was behind his election comes from the teachers union. So guess what? Where do the taxes go against him? In the business community that's hurting him, that's been complaining about him, and who are the beneficiaries? Again, black youths that he wants to campaign on, giving them jobs, giving them handouts, giving them welfare, and of course, the Chicago Public Schools, shoring up that teachers union support. This is what Brandon Johnson is doing right here, and he's pretending he's not doing that, even though his two main keys to power are black people and the teachers union, black people and the people who work for the Chicago Public Schools. That's where it's at. He's basically declaring war on the potential financiers and the potential challengers to his next election while pretending that's not what he's doing.
Your own budget director said the grocery tax would only cost the average Chicagoans $50 to $60 a year. Why not keep that in the budget and get that estimated $80 million?
Well, look, I mean, it goes back to what I said earlier, that this president has done such an awful job at managing the economic challenges of working people.
The mayor also defending his plan to sweep $1 billion in TIF funds, more than half of which would go to Chicago Public Schools.
What do you say to those who might see this as a budget for CPS, a reward for your allies?
A TIF surplus goes to our city colleges. It goes to our parks. It goes to our libraries.
But the majority
TIF
goes to
surpluses-
CPS.
Well, because that's the way the law is designed.
Right.
And so investing in CPS, that's a good thing, right?
So right here, I will say it's actually good politics for Brandon Johnson to say that he's not going to do the grocery tax, even if it will only cost the average Chicagoan like $60 a year. It's just not a good look right now with the price of groceries going up for you to continue to tax groceries. That being said, obviously that would produce $80 million. Brandon Johnson's adding to the budget deficit by not having that in there. But in reality, if you want to remove that, the thing that you should do is cut spending corresponding to that. And the thing is, if you actually lower taxes in certain areas and you get more economic activity, one of the things that you'll find out is that you'll get additional revenue. And what we actually discover when looking at the books for the city of Chicago is that revenue is actually up. And part of the reason why is we have these tax cuts. We have a new administration cutting back on regulations at the federal level. We also have a rebound from the COVID era. We also have inflation, but again, the budget is significantly higher than the new tax revenue. And if Brandon Johnson just kept it in line with inflation, he wouldn't be in this deficit in the first place. So Chicago has a spending problem, and all these different various taxes are just the tip of the iceberg, because guess what? Once that employment tax doesn't work and employers shave down employees or relocate or shift to remote work, what Brandon Johnson is going to do in response to that is that he's going to lower the threshold or increase the dollar amount. And again, you're going to start killing the golden goose, or the goose that lays the golden eggs, while pretending you're a man of the people. But I absolutely love that Brandon Johnson is getting smoked all over local television. Nobody's buying into it. The aldermen are like, yeah, we're not getting on board with this absolute idiot. And he's proposing a tax that even the more left-wing Seattle would not buy into. But again, I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. As per usual, if you like the video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social media, support me via support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about Brandon Johnson completely falling apart under scrutiny. Till next time.